one question actually, and when I was sort of alluding to it when I asked about that international dimension, which is, and Sa'eed mentioning kind of like this idea that, you know, it's very simple. It is a hashtag EndSARS, and there is an element here to which what we see in Nigeria is also kind of linked up, influenced by the politics that is happening outside Nigeria. So it's very localized, but it's definitely there's, you know, it's in conversation. How much influence, I mean, both of you can answer this. How much influence do you think like Black Lives Matter, like the methods, the style, like just the you know, the way you do cross-class politics, like has this had an impact on how this politics is being conducted in Nigeria? And like what are sort of some of the consequences of that?
So one of the things that I found striking when I first saw the videos of the protests emerging was that I heard lots of British and American accents. By no means does that characterize the people who are on the streets in general. But I do think there is a kind of thread that you could see. When the Black Lives Matter protests were happening around June time, you saw a lot of people on Twitter and Nigerians on Twitter talking about how there's this global movement against police brutality and circulating experiences of brutality on the continent. And that wasn't limited to just Nigerians. And I think maybe some connections were being drawn there to the question of policing more broadly. In terms of the international dimension of the movement, I mean, we've seen large protests, not just in Nigeria, and I think maybe that's something that's kind of been absent in the coverage in terms of mainstream media, but there have been huge protests in London. Certainly the biggest protests I've seen of Nigerian nationals. There have been protests I've seen protests in India, you know, all around the globe. And I think there is a sense in which, given that there is a society in which more broadly, you know, there are the two kind of ways of forms of social repression in the form of sort of deference around social class, but also deference around age. I think being buoyed by an international movement of solidarity, and that came very quickly, you know, people jumping on the hashtag, jumping in celebrities' comments on Twitter, getting celebrities to, you know, educate themselves on the movement, educate themselves on the questions on the situation in Nigeria. It meant that there was a sense in which, where previous protest movements had been sort of quashed either through the co-option of individuals, which is where the sort of leaderless politics comes from, or through, you know, the arrest, you know, Shoire was arrested after the Revolution Now protests. So because there was a sense in which the world was watching and the world was on the side of the youth, that I think that is kind of been a key driver in terms of the kind of, sorry, words are failing me at the moment, but I guess the kind of audacity, some might say, to challenge the state and take on a state which is so willing to use violence. I mean, what we saw in Lekki last Tuesday wasn't the first time violence had been used by the state in relation to these protests. The first wave, we saw water cannon, we saw live rounds being fired into crowds. So certainly, it was very clear very quickly that the state was happy to resort to violence.
Sa'eed, do you want to add to that? So the question was about the influence of Black Lives Matter on these protests, and maybe you could connect that to the point you were making earlier, which is about how what we were confronted with was this very uncomplicated slogan, and one that seemed to not necessarily, in being so simplified, didn't necessarily immediately evoke some of the more difficult political questions or subjects that it's now ended up touching on the movement. So yeah, you can finish off that point and then also touch on the influence of BLM.
Thanks. Yeah, thanks for summarizing my point brilliantly amidst the collapse, it seems, of my connection here. But yeah, I mean, I don't know that we are aware of direct links to BLM at the moment. Certainly, I think the group of people who took to the streets in Lekki and a lot of the kind of online activists have been aware or BLM probably followed and supported Black Lives Matter. And there were even Black Lives Matter placards at the protest venues that I went. So clearly, I mean, some people certainly see this as, you know, part of a wider global kind of agitation to resolve questions of policing, particularly in Black societies. People like Sheun Kuti have also been quite vocal in pointing out links to wider questions of Black liberation. Yeah, and I guess to try to tie it back to the previous point, I think that's part of what makes this both a quite unique moment.
I'm going to blame Governor Bello for this. So it's either Governor Bello or that other governor from Kaduna State who is behind this.
Yeah, he heard some of our comments before the show. This is politically motivated. This is actually politically motivated.
It's totally politically motivated. But you, Annie, you were gonna make a. You said there was one comment that you were gonna make, and you sort of like you had a brain freeze there. Yeah.
Yeah. Sorry. The comment I was going to make is that one other aspect to the story. There were so many subplots here, but has been the long-term declining economic conditions and opportunities for youth. But that in Nigeria, and that hasn't meant that they've been characterized by the president, turned into sort of lazy youth. In fact, there's been a kind of upsurge in innovation, and we've seen this in terms of tech, which has been brought to bear on these protests. The protesters, Feminist Coalition, were able to, in a speed that was remarkable to everybody, set up a response line for protesters and organize and mobilize people. And I think also the skills of young people who haven't been able to enter the job market were brought to bear. You know, medics, lawyers, etc., have all rendered their services pro bono. And in terms of the mobilization, yes, the size has been remarkable, but also the slickness of the kind of supporting operation has both been incredible in terms of what people would expect from Nigeria, but also incredible in terms of how that holds a mirror up to a government which has not been able to provide any of these services to people for so long.